International law is one of these things, it's a little bit like the air, where it's everywhere. We don't really notice it. So when you get on a plane and you fly to Europe, the ability to get on that plane, cross over the airspace of other countries, sometimes you see the little map when you're in the plane and it shows you're crossing over Greenland or whatever. All of that is governed by international law in different ways. Different treaties are in place to take care of all the questions that might arise about aviation. So that's a really mundane example. And then at the other extreme, we've got much more contentious examples, like let's take the war in Iraq. So as most of us remember, in the run-up to the war, the Bush administration went to the Security Council at the United Nations and tried to get a second resolution. And they're doing that because there's a legal framework in place that governs the ability of countries to enter into armed conflict. So, so between those two bookends, a zillion other examples, but I think the thing to recognize about international law is in a globalized world, in an integrated world, you're constantly dealing with things that are crossing borders or you're crossing borders, and international law is usually playing some role in shaping that. The most common thing are treaties, and most of us are familiar with, I mentioned aviation. There are treaties governing that. The UN itself was created by a treaty. So treaties are kind of the backbone, a little bit like we think of statutes in the domestic context. But we do have something like common law. We call it customary law. So a good example would be the law of the sea. It's all kinds of rules about ships and their ability to go on the high seas and who can board and where they can cross. Most of that is governed by custom. And the idea is this custom kind of accrues over time, like the common law becomes entrenched and accepted as law. And then there's also courts, right? So we have the International Court of Justice, sits in The Hague. We've got a series of other courts, right? The World Trade Organization has a court and so forth. So there's a set of judicial institutions, much like in our domestic system. So in a lot of ways, it's a very similar system. There isn't, I suppose, a constitutional equivalent. There isn't a kind of grand governing thing, but there are literally tens of thousands of treaties. So a surprising amount of topics are covered. There are a whole wide set of international organizations. So, from the United Nations being the most broad, the most elaborated, probably the most famous. World Trade Organization is a little more specialized, and then you've got dozens and dozens and dozens, thousands probably, of these subsidiary international organizations, international, maritime organization dealing with law of the sea questions, and so on down the line. And these have been created over the years. Some of them date back to the 19th century, but for the most part, that's a kind of 20th century phenomenon. So one of the things we see in the last century or so has been, one, the rise of these international organizations, the UN being the paramount example, and two, the use of treaties. Treaties existed in the past, but when we talked about custom and common law, that was much more common. Now we tend to codify that in a treaty. So those two things are sort of two major trends of the last century. Have a treaty, for example, in which every country is a member of that treaty and so would be governed by that. And in fact, we have lots of treaties that are pretty close to that, which you've got virtually every single country. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, I think, is a good example where only the United States and Somalia, when I last checked, were not parties to that treaty. The United Nations Charter comes pretty close, right? So virtually every country, Switzerland for a long time was a holdout, virtually every country is part of the UN system and so governed by the rules of the UN Charter. So there's no barrier to that, and we do see it.